This is the first lecture, part 2 for Geology 100 Natural Disasters, Human History and its ties to the geologic and climate record. We know approximately how long humans have been on the planet and what changes have occurred amongst the different species. So to begin with, we have this plot of temperature over the past 150,000 years. This is simply an indication of how dynamic the climate has been. When the temperatures are low, that means the plot is to the left, then you're in a period of glaciation. When the temperatures are higher and all the glaciers are melting, then you're in this interglacial period. Over the past 150,000 years, we've shifted from this glacial period to a warmer period, slowly shifted back to this glacial maximum at about 20,000 years ago, followed by a drastic increase in temperatures, and then we've been hanging out at this relatively stable climate for the past 8,000, 10,000 years. When we talk about the different species of humans that have been around, some of these numbers are of course beyond our scale that we're looking at. There is most likely some links to the climate record. So to start off with, Australopithecus was around at least 4 million years to about 2 million years ago. That really coincides with the onset of the Pleistocene Ice Age and went until about 10,000 years ago. That last glacial maximum, as we can see on this plot, it was a very cold period of time, was about 20,000 years ago. Then it took a few thousand years for the temperatures to increase drastically, and we've been hanging out at this interglacial period since then. So the Homo sapiens were alive from 200,000 years ago till now. What we can see from this plot is simply that Homo sapiens have seen drastic temperature changes. They have seen climate swing from as cold as it gets to as warm as it gets over this past 200,000 years. And we, somehow, as a species, have survived these events. At about 60,000 years ago, that's when humans left Africa, somewhere between the deepest glaciation and these interglacial periods. So it was pretty cold, but as they got to higher and higher latitudes, then this glacial period occurred and kind of trapped humans in specific locations. So even though humans got out of Africa at 60,000 years ago, now of course from 8,000 years ago until today, the stable, warm climate has allowed us to do some pretty amazing things, and that's what we're going to talk about. You may have heard of a lot of big extinctions that occurred at the end of the Pleistocene. Megafauna, mastodons and mammoths and giant ground sloths and dire wolves. These big events occurred somewhere right when this temperature, minimum temperature, and then came up to this maximum. So this is the period of time during which a lot of species just did not make it because the climate was so dynamic that it wasn't easy to survive in most of these ecosystems. This, of course, is climate, and it's tied, and we're going to actually talk more about climate later on in this course, but climate isn't everything. There were other things that occurred as well. So here's a shot of the Earth in a region of the world that you may or may not be familiar with. This is kind of centered on Southeast Asia, and if we zoom in, this is where we get to this lake on the island of Sumatra. And so this lake that looks kind of interesting, it's this kind of circular lake with a peak somewhere in the middle, is what's referred to as Lake Toba. So Lake Toba is a pretty significant location in terms of human history at about the 74,000 year mark. We've actually determined that Lake Toba is a caldera. It is a series of nested calderas. These are explosion and collapse features that have occurred as a function of large-scale volcanic eruptions. And they are different ages. So we have one that occurred 74,000 years ago, that's the most recent one that occurred 500,000 years ago, and another that occurred 800,000 years ago. So this is a repeat eruption location. Here is a volumetric plot showing here's Toba eruption at 74,000 years before present, Mount St. Helens, there's Krakatoa, Tambora. All of these events we consider to be relatively significant, but it turns out that that Toba event is the biggest one in the most recent geologic past. A large-scale eruption occurred 75,000 years ago on the island of Sumatra, and at that point it was actually connected to the mainland because sea levels were lower, but a large eruption occurred 3,000 times larger than Mount St. Helens' eruption, and it dumped huge amounts of ash into the atmosphere. Big shifts in weather patterns resulted. It's kind of similar to other big eruptive events that we have seen. The timing starts at the bottom and it goes up to the top. And so this is what we refer to as a population bottleneck. So it's time along the y-axis, and the x-axis is really from this point 0, it's showing the population. When this event occurred, there were a large number of people alive on the planet. And then you can see that there's this black line that refers to the Toba 74,000 year event. It was a large scale event that certainly killed a number of people, but more importantly, it dumped this ash into the atmosphere that caused that volcanic winter that lasted for probably years, and then it generated this cold snap that occurred for probably 1,000 years, followed by a climatic period of time during which it was very cold conditions. So it wasn't so much just a volcanic eruption. It was a volcanic eruption that fed a volcanic winter, that led into this glacial maximum, that led into a cold period. The population was severely stressed throughout here. And the best calculations were that for Toba, the human population on Earth almost got wiped out. There was something on the order of hundreds of reproducing humans that survived this event. This is one of these potentials where humans might not have survived. Now it turns out that there have been a lot of these things, these large-scale eruptions that have occurred at times in the past. Even in North America, we see evidence of these big volcanic eruptions. Here's Yellowstone, and the Yellowstone most recent event dumped huge amounts of ash over North America. There's the Long Valley caldera in California that did the same thing. Crater Lake about 7,600 years ago, Glacier Peak. So this is not a unique situation, but a lot of these are older events that humans weren't around for. So these geologic events certainly can have a large effect on the human population. So as we look into the future, that could be a potential source of large-scale change. Other events include meteor impacts. We certainly know that the dinosaurs died off at this 65 million year event. So if we look around the planet, did humans experience any meteorite impacts? This is Meteor Crater, which is in northern Arizona. It's about 1 kilometer wide, that resulted from an impact that occurred about 50,000 years ago. Now when we look at this, there's a lot of evidence for exactly what happened. A meteorite hit the surface, blasted a hole, threw a bunch of sediment into the air. But the reality is this is not one of these massive events. That during human history we probably haven't seen any gigantic meteorite impacts such as that wiped out the dinosaurs at 65 million years ago. Have humans seen large-scale climatic change from meteorites? Probably not. So at this point we can tie climate directly to geography and the path of humans around the planet. Homo sapiens have been surfing this wave of good weather, certainly for the past 8,000 years. And before that, they effectively moved around as a function of these climatic shifts. We know that previous groups faced extinction, such as Neanderthals and Australopithecus, or they faced hard times due to these climatic shifts. So what we're looking for now is simply historical evidence. Where do we see these shifts of humans around the planet? And the best source of information comes from the Fertile Crescent. Once humans made it out of Africa, which we refer to as the cradle of humanity, they made their way to this nice middle ground, not too cold, not too warm, and this is where these large-scale societies blossomed during this period of time. We're talking approximately 8,000 years ago, plus or minus a few thousand. It lasted a long period of time. And the Fertile Crescent is from the Tigris and Euphrates River on the east all the way to the Nile River on the west. These were the sweet spot during that kind of glacial warming and stabilizing event. Once the climate stabilized enough, humans moved into a spot where and be able to survive for long periods of time. So this led to the development of major civilizations: Mesopotamian, Babylonian, Sumerian, Akkadian. These are these ancient societies. This was followed by this need for hydraulic infrastructure, and at that point they started to build dams and started to do irrigation and started to build more significant bureaucracy. And at that point we get into these Egyptian societies and the Persian societies, and that led the spread of this Mediterranean culture and this dominance kind of around the world. Now we continue a little bit further, and we can see that even over the past couple thousand years, the climate has continued to shift a little bit. So here is our temperature anomaly, so that if the climate was totally stable, it would be hanging out at the 0 line. But we can see that there was a medieval warm period where it was half a degree or so warmer than normal, and then this little ice age that occurred between 1200 and 1800 where the temperature dropped a little bit. So just as a function of this small scale, less than a degree temperature change, turned out glaciers kind of melted around the planet to some degree during this medieval warm period, and glaciers expanded a bit around the world during this little ice age. We, of course, since then have been seeing this increased temperatures. So this medieval warm period that occurred from 900 to 1300 AD, even though it was a small scale temperature change, a lot happened in terms of human civilization. This is the point where the Vikings headed out from northern Europe because temperatures were starting to warm. So they made it to Iceland, they made it to Greenland, they made it to North America because of the fact that the temperatures were slightly warmer, the glaciers had retreated ever so slightly, meaning kilometers on the surface of the Earth. But at the same time, these same people that spread out into these warming lands then had to face these colder temperatures, again, only about half a degree colder afterwards. So it was total destruction of these Viking establishments in Greenland and North America only 300 years later. So during this little ice age, 1350 to about 1850 AD, resulted in the expansion of Europe's glaciers. So everything was maybe 1 degree colder than today. These small scale temperature climatic shifts actually have affected humans and where they exist on the planet. And so when we get to more recent events, such as big earthquakes, San Francisco in 1906, the Mount St. Helens eruption in 1980, the Sumatran earthquake and tsunami in 2004, Hurricane Katrina, and the Japanese earthquake, each of these is affecting humans, again in this relatively small scale way, but we can relate these geologic events directly to societal change.